Hey, I'm Katie Freeman with Freeman Furnishings, and in this video I'm gonna show you some experimentation that I did with some crayons, some army men that didn't work out. Look forward to that, a public service announcement in the middle of the video. And resin work. And I want to give a big shout out and thank you to Wagner Spray Tech for sponsoring this video. I used their Furno 700 gun in doing all of the work in melting the crayons and also getting the bubbles out of the resin and whatnot. So I will be sharing some lessons learned through this experimentation. I had a fun time, messed around with a bunch of different stuff, and looking forward to getting to it. So let's get started. From sapling to heirloom, every piece has a story, and it's our job to share that story. For this project, or really it's a series of projects, the tools and the materials used are pretty simple. So really, I had never really experimented with doing anything with crayons, and I've seen a few other makers use crayons as a highlight feature to add some color to their wooden woodwork pieces. But I wanted to just mess around and do something with some crayons and resin and see what I could come up with. Really, this first experimentation is just to get an idea of how the crayons are going to melt. I had no idea what to set my Furno 700 Wagner heat gun at. So the first few runs, I actually had it at about 600 degrees, and I had the fan turned all the way up. I'm going to tell you right now that that is way too high of a temperature, and the fan was also way too high. As you can see, you get splatter because the airflow coming out is just too much, and the wax from the crayons melts at way lower temperature. I did end up learning by the time I get to my last round of the crayon and resin experimentation that it's pretty much perfectly set if you set the temperature right around 350 degrees, and if you put the fan on either all the way down on low or just 2 bars up. You don't really need to go any higher than that, and that gives you the maximum amount of control in your melting. But as you can see, so pretty much with all of these experimentations, I melt like a base, and then I stick other crayons into the base and kind of move them around to where I want them to be. This one, I still was having a hard time getting the melt that I really wanted to get, just again because I had the gun temperature up too high and the fan up too high, so it wasn't really melting the way that I wanted to. During this experimentation, my son came in and he was like, "You know what, Mom? This really looks like sea anemones with the crayon sticking up." And I was like, hey, that's a really great idea, because at this point I really didn't know just what I was going to be making. So I went with that theme and kind of went with the brighter reds and oranges and yellows, and then tinted the resin with blue alcohol ink just a little bit. And then I wanted to also do kind of like, so there's different creatures in the sea that have a luminescence, bioluminescence in them, and they'll glow. So that's kind of what I was trying to go after with adding some glow in the dark powder. Didn't quite really achieve that, but I achieved quite a bit, so I'm happy with that. So these turned out okay, but you can tell that they're just half circles. You can't really do anything with them. And I also learned pretty much right away with this first run that because the crayons are wax, the resin is not really going to stick to it, and so you can get some delamination spots. So my next version, I had bought these army men from Goodwill, and I was like, well, I really wanted to try melting some army men too, and so I got started with that, and I'll just let you see kind of what happens here. It's not a good end result. Please excuse the interruption of your regularly scheduled program, but I have a little bit of a news alert for you. So during this video, you're watching me right now melt this. Soon, you will hear the fire alarm go off. So here is what I learned after the fact, that unless you can find the symbol on the bottom, you can see the very bottom of these army men that I did get melted, unless you can see the symbol that this is plastic that can be recycled, do not melt it, okay, because it will let off some toxic fumes. You need to make sure you have all the right respirators and stuff, and it will make the fire alarm alarm go off. So, lesson learned, don't melt army men unless you can find or any plastic really, unless you can find the symbol on the bottom, which these do not have. All right. Alright, so I knew I wasn't going to do anything more with the army men, and that's totally fine. And because I really hadn't perfected yet what I wanted to do with the crayons. I did like the coral reef idea, but then I had this idea of like the Blue Mountains Majesty type thing, and so I wanted to do a whole different color palette with using greens and blues and a mixture of those two colors together. I thought that maybe if I used painter's tape I could keep the cluster of crayons together, because I really was going for this like mountain range type look. I was hopefully going to get the whole like Northern Lights things going on here. You will see that that is not what happened, but that is what I was trying to go after here. So again, I learned this is where I'm starting to refine the setting the temperature and the fan speed down a bit. You can see I'm getting a bit more control over the melting of the crayons. So I'm definitely happy with how the crayons melted in this one, and I got these new molds so that I could do the full sphere, because I was still going with this idea of kind of like a paperweight is what I thought I would end up coming up with. So I put the resin in. However, I poured the resin too deep for the type of resin it is, and so it overheated, and because it overheated, it melted the wax more, and so you really can't see through the resin. Plus I had some serious bubble issues, and that's all on me just because I poured it too thick for the type of resin it was. Alright, so now I'm at iteration number 3, and I'm going back to this whole underwater idea because I do really like that. So I found some bigger pieces of crayons that I could use. Again, I melt a base, and then I put the bigger crayons in there that are going to serve kind of like sea anemones or sponges or whatever underwater coral reef type things. I've got my temperature dialed in at 350 and my fan speed dialed in at low. So I wanted to do the sphere, but I'm going to be transferring it to a square flat mold, and so in order to do that I thought I'd try heating up some tools to try to cut the solidified crayon. I'm gonna tell you what, that stuff is really hard to cut, but I did end up with, before some of it fell apart, I did end up with one solid piece. You'll see here that I've got one half of a sphere with some of the already melted stuff in there, and then I put them in the square mold, and I do a little bit better job of kind of placing them in there and trying to get this like sand undersea vibe. Then I take some carving tools. I use the heat gun to actually heat up the carving tools. I've got the fan down to nothing, and I've got the heat at about 300. I just heat up the tip, and then I'm using that to carve in details and then pour in the resin. So this time again, apparently I hadn't completely learned my lesson. I still poured the resin a little too thick for the type of resin it was, and so it did get a little hotter than normal, and because of that it did melt some of the crayon. And amazingly enough though, it only melted the pink one, really. I mean, it melted the yellow a little bit, but not the orange at all, or the red, but the pink. I still used alcohol ink to tint the resin blue, and then I used glow-in-the-dark powder again. Now luckily the wax floated to the top, and so I could just scrape that off with my carving tools and then put on a top coat, and it looks amazing. At least that's what I think. Alright, well, I'm super ecstatic with how this last kind of rendition of the project turned out. I think it definitely looks like a seascape. This is where you can see that the crayon had done some melting, but I was able to scrape it off, and now I'm just calling it like a sea sponge releasing its spores. I think people would totally buy that. There is a little bit of delamination down here, again because the resin just doesn't want to stick to the wax of the crayons, which is understandable. And you can see the glow-in-the-dark powder on the back, so if I turned all the lights off right now this would totally glow, and it's really awesome. So super ecstatic with this. So some things that I learned that I would want to take with me if I was going to do like a crayon and resin work with my woodwork is that, again, the resin doesn't want to stick to the crayons because they're wax. So I've seen some makers put like route little troughs in their wood, and that's what they put the crayons into, and they melt, and then they put the resin over the top to seal it in. I would want to make sure that there was at least a little bit of a lip or edge of wood above where the crayons, the level that the crayons melted to, in order for the resin to stick to the wood, so that the resin wouldn't have any tendency to pop out of that groove over time. So that's one key lesson. The next lesson I would say is, again, I learned, I had to dial it in after a while, that 350 degree temperature and the fan down on low, or just one notch above low, with the Furno 700 gun from Wagner is the best setting for it to be on to get the best results. And that I really did have fun. I think like carving crayon could be a way to actually maybe hone some of your hand carving skills. I had a lot of fun heating up the tools to get things like these dash marks, and then over here some of these dimples to make it look more like sea sponges and sea anemones and whatnot. So those are the lessons I learned from doing this series of projects. I hope those lessons help you guys out when you're making things and you want to try out new materials. If you like this video, make sure you hit subscribe. If you're not already, hit the notification so you can be notified when I have a new video with a new project out. And hit that like and comment below and let me know your thoughts. If you have any more questions, I'm happy to help. And another big shout out to Wagner Spray Tech for sponsoring this video. Thank you very much. And I will catch you guys all later.